Well, hello, class. Starting a new section now. The next several chapters, chapters 11 through 15, we're going to be looking at pay, benefits, and terms and conditions of employment. And again, so critical that we have a solid understanding of these areas because, again, even if you never go into a job, if you're not a lawyer or anybody that in the compliance or HR fields, what you're going to learn in these next several sections are going to apply to you no matter where you go, especially if you get into management or even if you don't get into management. Everything we're going to be discussing over the next several chapters is going to be very relevant to you as an employee of whatever company or organization that you belong to. So chapter 11, all about wages, hours, and pay equity. And again, there's a lot of information in this chapter. There's a couple of things that I want you to focus on that I think are really the most important things. The chapter starts out with a discussion of the FLSA, the Fair Labor Standards Act. It's incredibly important that you understand the details of the FLSA, the Fair Labor Standards Act. And really, there's three main things that I want you to know for the FLSA and kind of the main things associated with it is the FLSA does three things. One, it provides a minimum wage. So, different states have different minimum wage laws. Some areas are more than others. Some states have different, generally the West Coast and the Northeast tend to have higher minimum wages than the Midwest and the South. That's just kind of a general rule of thumb based on geography of the U.S. But again, even within states, individual municipalities can have their own minimum wage. So Chicago can have their own minimum wage. New York City, LA, different groups, cities can have their own minimum wage. So that it establishes that. Second, there are limits on minors. So if you are a minor, the FLSA provides certain rules that you have to abide by, and employers have to abide by as far as how many hours that minor can work, and basically it regulates minor work so that so that employers can't take advantage of minors essentially. And then third, it provides for overtime. So, generally, if you get paid on an hourly basis and you work more than 40 hours in a given week, you are entitled to overtime, which is time and a half work. Now, again, make sure you understand those three elements of the FLSA because it'll definitely be a test question. But again, the FLSA is so relevant to anything that you do in the working world. So make sure that you know that very well. On page 423, I think it's table 11.1, there's a really good discussion about what certain things are compensable and what are not compensable. A lot of times, with the FLSA and a lot of legal cases have revolved around when somebody is doing something, whether or not they should get paid for it. So, like for example, if your company has, let's say you're in Chicago and your company has a location in downtown in the heart of the city and then in one in the suburbs. If you're required to travel between those two locations, to do your job, generally you'll get paid. That's compensable. You should get paid for going between the two locations as part of your job. But if you are at home and you're driving to work, generally you don't get paid for that, because imagine, if people did that, they would intentionally live 2 or 3 hours away just so they could get paid for 2 or 3 hours driving. So, but again, those are just two examples. So make sure that you study page 423, table 11.1 very closely because again, and you need to know what are generally compensable and what is not compensable. So make sure you understand that. One of the other big elements of this information is I think it's on page 432, the idea of whether you are exempt or non-exempt. Again, two very important terms for you to know because, again, this determines whether or not you are subject to the FLSA's overtime. If you are exempt, generally it means that you are a salaried employee. You get paid, on a salary. You tend to have, you tend to have a little bit more managerial discretion or professional ways to do your job. Whereas a non-exempt, generally you get paid on an hourly basis. You record your time. They tend to be, primarily non-managerial type work. And again, there are exceptions to both of those, and I don't want to bore you with those details. But make sure you understand the general differences between exempt and non-exempt. And the way that you do that, and way most courts and the FLSA have ruled, is to what we call the primary duties test. And that is, again, your textbook does a good job of discussing the primary duties test about, what is primarily the purpose of your job, and the reason that we use that test is so that employers can't take advantage of you. So, for example, if you are primarily doing, we'll say, more administrative assistant work and secretarial work, generally that type of work is more non-exempt and you get paid on an hourly basis, generally speaking. So what this primary duties test prevents a company from doing is saying, okay, well, actually, we're just going to call you a supervisor and we're going to pay you a low supervisory salary so we don't have to pay you overtime. So that's what it's kind of prevented to use from companies from being able to take advantage of workers, essentially. So by mislabeling them, because just because we call you a supervisor or a manager doesn't necessarily mean that you are exempt automatically and then you don't get overtime. So, and again, if you get overtime, if you work more than 40 hours, so in a given week, so let's say Monday through Friday, if you work more than 40 hours, you are entitled to time and a half. So, 1.5 times your salary. And again, that's a rolling calendar week. So you can't just, kind of aggregate it up. It has to be in a rolling, a calendar 40-day period or 40-day hour period, so to speak. So that's kind of how we look at the primary duties test. Your book does describe some additional things about white collar jobs, executive level jobs. I want you to read that, but don't worry about that area that so much for the exam because I'm not going to cover that information on the exam. That's a little beyond this class. Just as long as you understand exempt versus non-exempt, that's what I want you to know. Your book this chapter finishes out with a discussion of some other wage laws. Again, I don't want you to have to worry about memorizing those wage laws because the chances are you won't even deal with those in your regular job. I don't even deal with them, and I deal with this stuff daily. So the section on other wage laws, again, read it just so you're aware of it, but none of that will be on the exam. However, I do want you to pay really close attention to the Equal Pay Act. In the Equal Pay Act, it prevents, a company or an organization from paying, a man a certain rate and then a woman who does basically the same type of work a lower rate. And again, it kind of seems, well, duh, why would we do that? But again, there is still a lot of examples in our culture of one gender, particularly women, getting paid lower than men for doing substantially equal work. And again, the Equal Pay Act was created so that if a man and a woman are essentially doing the exact same work, it is illegal to pay one sex more than the other sex. So make sure you pay careful attention to the Equal Pay Act because that will be covered. So. All right. Well, again, a lot of information in a short video, but again, we all work to get paid. Let's be honest. We all go to work so we can earn money. So this chapter is very important for you to understand, not just as an employee, but as a potential future supervisor, manager, leader of others about what is fairness as it relates to pay and equity. So, all right. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next chapter.